please go to elithecomputerguy.com in order to view schematics, code, and more for the projects that you are learning about. So welcome back, boys and girls. Are you ready to be adults today? Are we ready to be real professional technicians today? No, probably not. I didn't think so. This is going to be one of those videos I'm going to get a lot of hate over because I'm going to treat you people kind of sort of like adults. And it really, really sucks when I have people that are gonna get my CCNA and they tell me what's what. And I just sit there going, well, that's nice. I've been doing this crap since 96 and yeah. So anyways, today I want to talk to you about open source in regards to Linux, right? Because that's one of the things in this modern world where we talk about GMOs and we talk about free range and we talk about all kinds of other things. Everybody bands behind a banner of something and they say, I'm for this. And sadly, so many times, people don't actually understand what that banner means. They're really loud. They're really excited. They're putting all of their energy into supporting the banner. But sadly, they don't really grasp what that banner actually means. And that's one of the issues we get into when we start talking about open source, especially as far as Linux goes. Because one reason a lot of people want to go to Linux is genuinely because they want to go open source, right? Some people want to go non-GMO, some people want to go non-animal product, other people want to go non-closed source, or I suppose open source. And they feel not only do they want to buy and use the products, but they want to support the open source model. The issue that you run into is a lot of people just don't quite understand what they're talking about, and that can run them into problems. And more importantly, in our world, it can run their company into a hell of a lot of problems. And so I want to talk about this today. When we talk about open source and we talk about Linux and people say Linux is open source, well, remember back in the intro class I did to this series where I said Linux isn't really Linux? Linux is the kernel, and then something called GNU Linux is the actual operating system. Ha! See, are you starting to understand where we're getting into the problems? You start getting into the problems. Linux is open source. But what is Linux? Is Linux an operating system or is it a kernel? So here's the deal. Linux, in the open source idea, is a kernel. GNU Linux is the entire operating system. And then you get into a whole bunch of mess otherwise. So I want to talk about this today because, again, open source in the real world is not what open source that noobs think it is. And this can cause you some issues. So the first thing that we need to do, boys and girls, is we need to talk about the olden times. The way back times. The way back times. Let's pull ourselves out some member berries and talk about how things were. Because I think one of the big problems nowadays with the new technicians is they're coming out into the modern world where open source and cloud computing and all this stuff is here. And of course, as every young generation imagines, this is how it's always been. Of course this is how it is, because this is how it's always been. They weren't around or they were pooping in their diapers back when we started on the road to get us to where we are today. And so a lot of times when people think about open source now is they hear about open source now and they only think about open source from this modern perspective, which again, may not be quite what you think it is. And so they don't realize where we came from and then why the whole concept of open source can get confusing. So I want to take you back to the way back days, back in like 1999 and 2000 when I was a technician. And the big problem that we had back then is all the software that we were using, essentially, more or less in the enterprise. We were using Microsoft operating systems. We were using things like Word. We were using Novell NetWare. Basically, we were using software from vendors that was all 100% proprietary and closed source. Now, I want you to understand what we used to mean by when we said closed source. So this was back in the glory days. I swear to you, you would pick up a newspaper and the classified section for just computer technicians was as thick as a modern newspaper. And that sounds like a joke, but sadly, no, it is true. Oh, there were so many jobs out there for A-plus technicians and all that kind of stuff. So the thing that you have to understand is money, no problem. Money was not an issue back then. I worked for one company where we literally spent $500,000 simply for license compliance software, right? So we're a few thousand person company. People had, Word and QuickBooks and operating systems and all that. And literally, we spent $500,000 simply to verify that all the computers on the networks were licensed how they were supposed to be licensed. So a lot of people now, again, when you think about open source, you think about free. I don't want to give Microsoft money. When we were thinking about closed source, open source back, whatever. Take some cash, take some money. The bigger problem was the software back then was buggy as all hell. Again, if you dealt with Windows 95, I sadly had to deal with Windows 95 in production. Sucked. You looked at that thing wrong. It crashed, right? If you dealt with Windows NT Server, anybody who dealt with Windows NT 4.0 Server, literally there were parts of Windows NT 4.0 Server that didn't work. It just didn't work. Like the control panels were there and everything was there, but then when you would try to set something up to do what it said in the book, there would be chapters. There would be a chapter. There's a whole chat. Oh, it goes into whole routing. You used to be able to use Windows NT 4.0 servers as routers. And there was actually a chapter in one of the training books that explained to you how to use a Windows NT 4.0 server as a router. And so I was going to do that for a client that one of my friends had, and literally it just did not work. There were 10 pages of documentation on how to do what I was trying to do. Let's just paint by numbers, and it didn't work. We literally ended up having to call Microsoft, and they told us to do something completely and utterly different because what was documented in the book didn't even do what it was supposed to do. So we had really buggy, quirky, nasty, horrible software. People had money though. And so basically the big argument back then was a lot of people just wanted to be able to see the frickin' source code. Again, when you have these companies, they have lots of money. They could throw 10 or 20 coders to go through and audit the source code to figure out where problems were. And then they just simply wanted the ability to go in and tweak things and make the things that were supposed to work actually do what the hell they were supposed to. That was the big thing when I came into the whole IT world. The whole idea, really the big push back then with open source was simply let me read the source code. Let me read the source code. Let me be able to modify the source code. I will pay you a crap ton of money. Just let me see what the hell is running on my systems. And of course, if you dealt with Microsoft 20 years ago, that wasn't going to happen. Novell wasn't going to happen. Microsoft wasn't. They're just like, no. And so one of the big pushes back then for the open source movement was simply the idea that we could see the code that was running on the systems so that we could look for the vulnerabilities or we could look for the problems. Because again, this was back in the day when things like memory leaks were regular issues. You would just have servers kill themselves every week or so simply because of just simple tiny little memory leaks where software wasn't clearing the memory the way it was supposed to. And so the idea was we just want to go and see the source code itself. So that is where I come from the idea of when we talk about open source. Now, as things went by, as people started writing open source software, there was a whole push for free software. So again, this is where people start talking about where open source should be free. And I actually remember this phrase from the Red Hat Linux class I took. So I took a Red Hat Linux 40-hour Red Hat Linux class 14, 15 years ago. And one of the things the instructor used to say is one of the arguments in the open source community is when you say free, is that as in free speech, as in I can read the code and modify the code, or is that as in free beer, as in I get it for free? And so as time has gone on, there's been more and more of a push that open source, you should not just simply be able to read and modify the code, but that it should also be free. But it is important to understand that that's an argument. And although people say, again, you get a lot of people pushing and saying, it has been resolved. Open source means open source, you can read it, and it's free. And what you realize when you get into the modern world is it's just not as simple as that. So that's the kind of history that I'm talking about and where we're coming from when we start thinking about open source and in regards to Linux. So now that we start having this idea of, what is open source? Is it free speech or is it free beer? This is an important thing to understand when we start talking about whether or not Linux is open source, because we've got all of those distributions out there. We've got a zillion distributions, and basically all those distributions are simply repackaging of different products that you then download and install onto your server or to your laptop. And so one of the questions that you have to be asking yourself when you think about open source is, what are you actually looking for? Are you looking for just simply free? I just want software or an operating system that is free to use, right? That's one way of thinking about things. Or do I want software that I can actually go and see what the code is? So this was pretty important a number of years ago when Adobe Flash was much more popular than it is today. So a lot of Linux distributions had Adobe Flash bundled with them so that you could use Adobe Flash. But the important thing to understand with that is Adobe Flash, although it was free for use, people didn't understand what was going on under the hood. You couldn't see the code, and therefore it was not open source. So this is something to be thinking about when you go out there and look for distributions, is what do you really care about? Do you care about free when you're talking about open source, or do you talk about the source code is actually open so that people can go and take a look at it? And so this is something like when you're thinking about Ubuntu or Red Hat or any of these different distributions, realize many of them are not completely open source. If we go over to the computer, I can show you that you can do a simple Google search. So again, if we go here, completely open source Linux distributions, and you can come here, and again, if this is something that you really care about, you can go and you can take a look at the different distributions that are completely 100% open source. Not only are they going to be free, but you're actually going to be able to go in there and read the source code. And so this is something that you should definitely be thinking about if you're one of these people that really care about the open source, and then also be thinking about, do you want proprietary software on your systems, or do you want to make sure that somebody can go in and actually take a look at all the code that is on your system? So if you've been following me up until this point, great! Now I'm about to make your brain hurt. I'm gonna make your brain hurt. Not by using some weird example from left field, but I'm actually gonna show you some of the idiocy that you'll see from one of the biggest names in the game, Red Hat Linux, right? Because you understand what open source is, right? Everybody understands what open source is. Eli sitting here talking about open source Linux. This is ridiculous. Eli, why are you even going into this? It is so simple. Well, let's go over and take a look at Red Hat's website. So this is actually Red Hat's website. Again, we go up here, we take a look at this, redhat.com, Red Hat Enterprise Linux. And what you can see here, again, makes you giggle. The foundation for your enterprise hybrid cloud, Red Hat Enterprise Linux, is the world's leading enterprise Linux platform. It's an open source operating system. Blah, 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 blah. Foundation, you can scale existing apps. We see it's open source. You're like, oh, wow, where can I download it for free? Well, if you click over here and he says, try it for free, we can see a single 30-day subscription for a variant of Red Hat Linux, access to Red Hat's blah, blah, blah. This evaluation is not intended for production use and requires a Red Hat account. Well, that seems kind of weird. Well, maybe I click on this whole buy it thing. Maybe if I go to the buy it, then they'll give me the free option. I go to buy online because it said it's open source, right? It said it's open source. Linux platform, Red Hat Linux, blah, blah, blah. Well, that's $350, and that's $2,500, and that's $179. If we go down here, that's $5,000, and there's $15,000. Well, where's the free version? Well, here's the interesting thing is basically what you have to do is you have to buy a subscription to Red Hat. So Red Hat Linux is quote unquote open source, but you need a subscription for it. So if we go over, take a look at the subscription page, that's what you're going to be paying that $349 to $15,000 for. Understand the Red Hat subscription model. The Red Hat subscription model has been in place for more than 2 decades. influenced by extensive customer feedback. A Red Hat subscription allows customers to download Red Hat tested and certified enterprise software. So this allows you to download their software. It also provides access to the guidance, stability, and security to confidently deploy these products even in the most critical environments. An active Red Hat subscription gives you continuous access to Red Hat software as it's developed by Red Hat and its partners. Simply maintain one active subscription per resource running Red Hat software to take advantage of the value we provide. Well, if it's open source, then what am I getting for this subscription? $350 to $15,000 a year. An active Red Hat subscription provides everything needed to run your system, including mission-critical systems reliably and securely. More than software, it's access to a community of experts, ongoing delivery of patches, bugs, fixes, updates, and upgrades, and then you get the technical support. Right? But think about that. So basically, theoretically, you can use it, but you don't get access to any updates or upgrades. If we scroll down, we can go to see what if a subscription is not renewed. If all of your subscriptions expire and you have no other active subscriptions in your organization, you retain the right to use the software under the applicable license terms. However, your entire environment will no longer receive any of the subscription benefits, including the latest certified software versions, security, errata, and bug fixes. So you stop paying that fee, you no longer get bug fixes. Obviously, you don't get technical support. And so that's an important thing to be thinking about. Right? Because right there, Red Hat says open source operating system. So it's open source and you can use it, as long as you pay $350,000 to $15,000 a year. And as soon as you stop doing that, then you don't get any updates or upgrades or anything. And so this is something to be thinking about when you're trying to figure out what distribution of Linux you're going to go for. Because again, if you're in an environment where you can pay for service contracts, maintenance contracts, right? You can pay $15,000 a year. You don't care. There you go. There's the money. Then Red Hat may be for you. But again, if you're looking at building out an environment and you realize the minute your company stops paying for those subscription fees, you no longer get updates, right? That might be scary. That might be the time you're like, well, maybe if we built this thing on Ubuntu, that might make a little bit more sense. So this is one of those things that is very important to understand. Again, and this is the Linux operating, Red Hat Linux operating system. This is one of those things that you have to understand. Again, when we talk about open source does not mean what the hell these noobs think it means. So you gotta be careful. So I just showed you some of the quirks with Red Hat, but let's talk about some of the other open source software that you may be using in your Linux environment and realize again why all this stuff can get really confusing and really scary quickly. So let's take a look at VirtualBox. So VirtualBox is a piece of virtualization software everybody in the tech world knows and a hell of a lot of people use. But if you go and you actually take a look at how their licensing is done, again, it gets a little bit more foggy and quirky than you may realize. So let's go over here, and this is the standard. This is virtualbox.org. This is the website. Welcome to virtualbox.org. VirtualBox, the powerful x86 AMD 64 virtualization product for enterprise as well as home use. So think about that. Not only is VirtualBox an extremely feature-rich, high-performance product for enterprise customers, it is also the only professional solution that is freely available as open source software under the terms of the GNU, the General Public License version. See about VirtualBox. Well, that sounds good, right? You're like, well, Eli, okay, so this is VirtualBox, it's open source, it's free, this is everything we want. So we go over here, we click on download VirtualBox, and from here, we can download. So we can download for Windows, we can download for OS X, we can download for Linux, Solaris if you still got it, right? So everything looks good there. But then let's start scrolling down a little bit. Let's start scrolling down a bit. What's this VirtualBox Oracle VM VirtualBox extension pack? Support for USB 2.0, USB 3.0, VirtualBox RDP, disk encryption, NVMe, and PXE boot for Intel cards, blah, 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 basically are all part of this extension pack. So the base of VirtualBox, anybody can use that. But then if you want to use something like USB 2, I mean, I'm doing this in 2019. If you want to use USB 2.0, you need this extension pack. But if you go and you look at it, the extension pack binaries are released under the VirtualBox Personal Use and Evaluation license. Well, wait a minute, what's that license? That's not the GNU license. And we go over here and we take a look. VirtualBox Extension Pack Personal Use and Evaluation License governs your access and use of the VirtualBox Extension Pack. It does not apply to the VirtualBase base package and or its source code, which are licensed under version 2 of the GNU General Public License. So it is important to understand this is an add-on. The core is under GNU, but this is an add-on that is not. And if we go down here, grant license. Oracle grants you a personal, non-exclusive, non-transferable, limited license without fees to reproduce, install, execute, and use internally the product on host computers for your personal use, educational use, or evaluation. Personal use is non-commercial use solely by the person downloading the product from Oracle on a single host computer, provided that no more than one client or remote computer is connected to that host computer, and the client or remote computer is used solely to remotely view the guest computer. Educational use, again, this is an important thing. When you say educational use, well, Eli can use this, right? Eli's an educator. But am I? Educational use is any use by teachers or students in an academic institution, schools, colleges, and universities as part of the institution's educational curriculum. Well, then I'm not actually an educator. Evaluation means testing the product for up to 30 days. After expiry of the term, you are no longer permitted to use the product. Personal use and or educational use expressly exclude any use of the product for commercial purposes or to operate, run, or act on behalf or on the benefit of business, organization, governmental, blah, 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 blah. And then it goes down here. You have restrictions. And again, remember the first part is open source. So VirtualBox, the core, is open source. But under restrictions and reservations and rights down here, you may not do any of the following. Modify any part of the product except to the extent allowed in the documentation accompanying the product. Rent, lease, lend, redistribute, or encumber the product. Remove or alter any proprietary legends or notices contained in the product. Decompile or reverse engineer the product except to the extent permitted by applicable law. So think about this, and really think about this when you're thinking about open source. So the core is open source. You can basically do whatever, it appears, let me be clear, it appears you can basically do whatever the hell you want with it. But if you want to use something as basic as USB 2.0, all of a sudden, if you use this extension pack, your entire world changes. So again, this is the type of thing that you need to be thinking about when you think about open source and what does it actually mean in the real world. Finally, on a little bit of a side note, just one of those interesting things going on with the whole open source community and the real tech industry that I think is kind of curious, is here's one of the questions. Riddle me this, riddle me that. What does open source mean in a service-oriented architecture world? This is one of those interesting things as somebody coming from the Gen X. So I was all excited. I was all excited for open source back in the day because open source was supposed to free technology. If you have a Linux operating system, if you put out the Linux operating system to the world, the great part is if you put that out as open source so anybody can use it, the fact of the matter is anybody then can use it. Whether Democrats want to use it or Republicans want to use it, whether lesbians want to use it or KKK people want to use it. One of the things with open source is basically you just put all the source code out there and anybody can use it. If you want to build a WordPress site, again, whoever the hell it is, anybody can put up a WordPress site, all of those types of things. Well, one of the interesting things that's been happening in the open source world, as more products have basically been captured by the service-oriented architecture world, we now have many services being sold by companies such as Amazon, Microsoft, these type of companies that are built on open source technology. But as far as you're concerned, all you get's API calls, right? So this is one of those interesting things to think about. So there's a lot of people getting really pissed off right at this point in time, where Amazon's a big player in this, where Amazon finds these amazing open source projects. They then bring in the open source project, they futz with it, they fiddle with it. They basically then bring a service online for AWS. They then may release the code that they created. They continue the open source thing going on, but the product that they built is now entirely within their environment. Or like one of the problems that you see, like with AWS and Amazon sometimes, is that some of the contributions they make to the open source world, frankly, unless you're AWS, you just simply can't use it. It's like, here's all of our code, but nobody can use this. We don't have an AWS in our data center, right? And so that's one of the curious things going on right now. And again, one of these things to be thinking about when we think about open source and we think about the ideals of open source. The ideals of open source for my generation was the idea of freedom, the idea of anybody could take these products and then they could deploy the services based off of what they thought was appropriate. You know, whether it's the Arab Spring or whether it's who the hell knows what else. The idea was that people were good. If you allow people to have the power over being able to transmit information, then that will make the world a better place. But one of the curious things happening now, and you see this in the political world, is you have the platforms that then take these open source projects. They then essentially wrap those open source projects into their own services. They then start selling those services built on open source technology, but now they've got a whole layer of terms of service and all kinds of wacky stuff that simply didn't exist when you simply had the open source code and products in the past. So that's one of the interesting things to be thinking about and a big argument nowadays. Again, like if a cloud provider is offering their services off of open source software, but all you get is an API call to what they're providing, that really does bring in a massive question of what the hell does open source really mean anymore. So it's just one of those things just to keep in mind and think about. So the last thing, if you're interested in this whole open source world, how it deals with Linux and the rest of the tech industry, one of the things that you may want to take a look into are the actual open source licenses that are available. Again, this is an important thing a lot of people don't seem to grasp, is open source isn't one license. It's not like there's an open source license. And so if it's open source, this is what it means. If it's not open source, it means something else. The fact of the matter is there are multiple or many different open source licenses. And so depending on what license was used in order to write the software that you're using, you may run into different issues. And so why this may be very important when you go into your career or if you're deploying software or Linux into your environment is to realize that when you're building up your environment, you may, if you use particular open source products, you may not be able to keep or to own the intellectual property on what you've developed. So there are some of these open source projects. So some open source projects simply say you're able to use this as long as you say, as long as you give us credit, X, Y, or Z, you're free to use this, right? And so then you can build on top of that open source project, and then you can own what is on top of that open source project. There are other open source licenses out there that basically say anything that is developed on top of our open source project has to also be open source. And so that may run into a problem for you and for your company. Again, I talk about way back in the day, I knew a CEO who did a very interesting thing for his company. Basically, he was running a logistics company. And way back in the 1970s, he saw the power of computers. But he realized computers weren't where they needed to be, but he knew they were going to get there. So he went and he talked with these folks at IBM, and he said, okay, so what's your roadmap for the computers? How fast will things be? And so what he did is he created logistics software for his company. He literally completed, they wrote all the software 3 years before there was a computer that was able to run it. Right? So he wrote all the software, basically let it collect dust, pulled it out after 3 years, got their fancy new computer, shoved it through the computer, it did what it was supposed to do, and then one of the things that he did is he actually sold it to his competitors. He didn't feel that the software was actually a major competitive advantage. He felt like he could make more money selling it to his competitors and they could still outcompete them. And so a major profit center for his company was literally selling the software that they developed for their company to other companies out there. Well, an important thing to be thinking about with this whole open source model If you build your side, you're sitting there and you're like, oh, okay, I don't want to reinvent the wheel. So let's start with one of these open source projects and build on top of it. Depending on what license you build on top of, you may then basically forfeit all of the intellectual property that you're creating by building on top of that particular product with that particular license. So this is where, as tech professionals, it's as important that you read things like licensing as contracts as it is understanding how to set up organizational units in Active Directory. So we go over, take a look at the computer. We can go over to the opensource.org, and they have an open source license by category. So they actually have a list of a number of these so many open source licenses. And just realize all these open source licenses are different. The Apache license you'll probably have heard of, the GNU license you've probably heard of, MIT license you've probably heard of, Mozilla license you've probably heard of. You've probably heard of a number of these licenses, but an important thing to remember is that, this is an actual thing. Again, so many people like in technology, they don't realize, no, that's an actual thing. That actually means something. It's not just words, right? Whatever that is what it is. So it is important to be thinking about when you're going to be starting to put products into your infrastructure, especially in this modern DevOps type world where so much of the stuff in an infrastructure, it may be hacked or it may be modified or may be built upon. It is really important to understand what are you giving up by using particular open source projects or products, and really think about what you're doing before you just jump into open source, and make sure, again, from a compliance standpoint, you understand what liability you're putting your company into. Pop, pop, pop. Oh, pop. There's just nothing pop more enjoyable in the entire world, pop, than popping little new bubbles. So that's a funny thing. Again, like open source. Open source is one of those deals where people start running around talking about open source, and it's like, that's great. Yeah, it's great. Talking about open source in that fashion while you're in college, that's cool. Try some drugs. Go do whatever kids do nowadays. Go, get high and talk about what open source really means to the world. But just realize when you get that corporate job, when you actually get shoved in the data center, open source might not actually mean what you think it means. And this is just one of those really big things just to be keeping in mind, because this type of licensing issue can really cause massive amounts of problems in the real world, especially when you get new technicians out there thinking, oh, I'm just going to do open source and this is going to be great. Again, you may run into everything from compliance issues, making sure all the products within your infrastructure are up to certain standards. You may get into issues with, again, like if you go with Red Hat, right? The whole thing where you get trapped, right? So you think, oh, yeah, sure, we'll set up, 5 Red Hat servers. That's $1,800 a year for a company that doesn't matter. And then you get 10 Red Hat servers, then you get 100 Red Hat servers. And at a certain point, somebody's like, 100, that's starting to get to be real money. That's $50,000 a year we're paying in licensing fees, literally to essentially run Apache web servers, right? And you sit there and well, we can just do that on something. Why do we keep paying for these maintenance contracts for, again, Apache web servers or some kind of file servers? That's ridiculous. And then you find out the minute you stop paying that $50,000 a year, you no longer get access to any updates, right? And so that can be a real problem. Whereas if you had just built your infrastructure off of Ubuntu or something else a few years ago, you might actually save a lot of money. Or you run into issues, and again, this is a real issue with something like VirtualBox, where the core, oh, look at that, isn't it so pretty? Just take it, just take the VirtualBox. You'll like the VirtualBox, right? You get to the problem of you just have something like VirtualBox, where again, the core product is open source and all, free beer and free speech, and it's great for everybody. But hey, if you want your USB devices to work faster than a frickin' snail, you might run into a major issue when you find out the extension pack has its own special license that has nothing to do with an open source license. And so these are things to really be thinking about, because I see with so many tech professionals, they think this stuff is all a joke, and it can just hammer the hell out of your company. So it is definitely something to think about. Again, go over, take a look at all those different licenses. Make sure when you go out there, whatever product you're going to put into production, make sure you read the license, all the license. If they say it's a GPL license, read the GPL license. If it's a product from Oracle or Microsoft or whatever else, read that license. Verify that you are allowed to do the things that you think you're allowed to do, because many times what you find out is when you read that license, you can't. And again, you deploy 1 box, 2 boxes, it doesn't really matter. Again, like if you deploy a box in your basement, I don't think Oracle is going to be breaking down your door, but it is important to understand you deploy 1 box in your environment, and then you deploy 5 boxes in your environment, and then somehow there's 20 or 30 boxes in your environment, and then you go through and there's some kind of technical audit. You know, folks actually come through and make sure that your infrastructure is compliant, and you find out, oh crap, we have a whole bunch of machines that literally are not legally allowed to be running, and they happen to be running some core components, and that's a bad thing. So these are some things to really think about and consider, and that I know a lot of people they just gloss over. They just say, Eli, it's open source. They're like, yeah, that's not how it works, bucko. It's just good for you on the motivation. Good for you on the excitement. Go read some books. So anyways, as always, I enjoyed doing this video. I hope it cleared up a couple of things. If nothing else, I hope you go and do some follow-on research for this. And with that, I'll see you at the next video.